Thank you for joining us this warm July evening for Pope Paul VI and Humanae Vitae, 50 years later. A public, air-conditioned talk. Our talk tonight is held in commemoration of the golden anniversary of the encyclical letter of His Holiness Paul VI on the regulation of birth. On the 25th of July, in the year of our Lord, 19,068, Blessed Paul VI, then the Roman Pontiff, released his letter to prelates, clerics, and all men of goodwill. Tonight, the 27th of July, 2018, we talk about it. Before we begin, the coordinator of this evening's talk, husband, father, and young scholar, Renee Fair, would like us to recognize the impending canonization of Blessed Paul VI to sainthood, which will occur on the 14th of October this fall. Now let us begin our introductions. My name is Brandon Tran. I will be your host this evening and perhaps your moderator. Our three speakers are University of Prince Edward Island professors. They are Drs. Robert Dennis, Ariana Patey, and Peter Koritansky. Now, although we have just begun our evening, I can already sense a pressing concern, a burning desire in all our little hearts. Dear moderator, your hearts cry out, will our esteemed and beloved professors remain afterwards to answer the questions of our curious little minds? And may we meet these, our scholars, heroes, heroine, and will they be available to sign autographs? Dear audience, my happy heart cries back, yes, yes, and yes. There will be a Q&A afterwards, followed by snacks and refreshments. The talks will be 10 to 15 minutes long, and I ask that you please hold your questions until the Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Dennis. After completing a political science master's and a history master's at Memorial University and at the University of New Brunswick, respectively, Dr. Rob Dennis pursued and completed his PhD in history at Queen's University in 2014. It was also during that auspicious year of our Lord 2014 that Dr. Rob joined us on the island as assistant professor and SDU visiting scholar in Catholic Studies in the Religious Studies Department at UPEI. Dr. Rob has taught courses varied on such subjects as Catholic moral thought, Christian mysticism, interreligious dialogue, the Age of Francis, and an experiential learning course, Catholic New York. For those unfamiliar with university jargon, experiential learning course is code for trip to New York City. This year, I hear, with Dr. Ariana Patey as well, it may be code for trip to Montreal. Although Dr. Rob has enough by way of publications, conference papers, and media appearances to list at length, I will not subject our glamorous star to too much flattery. It will be sufficient, I think, to tell you, dear audience, that our much-loved professor has written on the likes of the Montreal Canadiens' transition from the Forum to the Molson Centre, but also on the likes of Saskatchewan Catholics in the 1930s and 1940s. Dr. Rob is author of no fewer than 3 forthcoming publications. They cover the church engagement of modernity, to a history of SDU, to Catholicism and the Cold War. Today, Dr. Dennis speaks to us on the enigma of Paul VI, known by some as competitive barbecue champion, known affectionately by all as Dr. Rob. Please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Robert Dennis.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Can everybody hear okay? All right? If you can't, just wait, okay? Like, one of the worst things in the world is straining to hear at a public event. Right on. That's perfect. Okay, thanks so much. So I want to open just with words of thanks. Thank you to all of you for being here, for joining us in this celebration of the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, and a very special word of thanks to Renee Fair for conceptualizing this evening, organizing this evening, and to Brandon for moderating. It's wonderful to see people mark these very sort of special occasions, and a great honor for, I know, the three of us to be invited to speak to you. So I want to do two things with my talk, and I'm going to try not to go more than 10 minutes because I'd really like us to have a fruitful question and answer period. One thing I'd like to accomplish with my talk is just to give you some context for controversies surrounding Humanae Vitae. As much as we come together to celebrate, if you take this document and you bring it out to the modern, to the secular world, probably the most controversial encyclical. Not many encyclicals engender the kind of debate, at least the content, engender the kind of debate that Humanae Vitae would if you walked across the street at the Gahan House and said, let's talk about the regulation of birth, right? Okay. So I want to give you context. The second is that I'm hoping to raise more questions than answer them. Raise more questions than answer them, and then we can talk about some of these things in the question and answer period. Okay, I'd like to give you a few brief words on the title that I've proposed, The Enigma of Paul VI. And here I have sort of a double meaning. So let's start with enigma. Okay, enigma, a noun, referring to a person or thing that is mysterious, puzzling, or perhaps even difficult to understand. Okay, so meaning number one. To the modern and the secular world, and again, I want us to sort of step back, not just to look at this from the perspective of 2018, but to move back into the 1960s, right? The church has just emerged from the Second Vatican Council. It's a time of great renewal. We've had the short but vibrant pontificate of St. John XXIII. There's a lot of excitement around Vatican II, and then you come to the election of Paul VI. To the modern and secular world, one sees that the church has sought to engage in the Second Vatican Council, Humanae Vitae might be deemed an enigma. Its affirmation, and I'm going to quote Article 14 here, of the first principles of a human and Christian doctrine of marriage, when we are obliged once more to declare that the direct and interruption of the generative process already begun are to be absolutely excluded as a lawful means of regulating the number of children. Equally to be condemned, as the magisterium of the church has affirmed on many occasions, is direct sterilization, whether of the man or of the woman, whether permanent or temporary. Similarly excluded is any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically designed to prevent procreation, whether this be a means or an end. If we step back into the world of 1968, the West's sexual revolution is in full force. It's this final instruction which prompted newspaper headlines across the world to read, Pope bans pill. Humanae Vitae then was a puzzle that did not easily reconcile with the morality of the 1960s, and it might be said, at odds with the Western world. Among the key liberal criticisms of the document were, had it paid enough attention to modern science? Had it properly regarded the world's population problem? Enigmatic, then, are propositions affirming a prohibition against artificial means of contraception as consistent with the Church's traditional understanding of the family and natural law, and something that I think Dr. Koritansky will have some words on. Okay, so meaning number two. To some observers, Pope Paul VI was enigmatic. He was a mysterious figure who could be portrayed in one instance as a progressive, whether it be ecclesially, economically, or politically. And here I would cite his extensive writings on Catholic social thought and questions of international development, and in other instances conservative, particularly on social questions. Humanae Vitae might suggest this as for critics of Pope Paul and/or for observers hoping that post-Vatican II would bring a new permissiveness on questions of Catholic social ethics, alluded to in Meeting 1. We may not think of this point that much today. I think John Paul II was in some ways a little bit like this, but grafted against a newly emerging post-consular church in the 1960s, observers found it difficult at times to pare down expectations with pontifical action. Okay, so let me give you some background. Let me background both of these meanings for the comments to follow. Let me give you some background for the document itself. So Pope John XXIII, who of course serves between 1958 and 1963, had formed the Pontifical Commission on Population, Family, and Birth Rates. It's commonly referred to as the Birth Control Commission in 1963. Its purpose was to prepare for the Holy See's participation in a conference organized by the United Nations and the World Health Organization. Paul VI kept and also expanded this commission following his election. The commission leaned to reforming church teaching on questions of artificial birth control. And we have to remember that contraception or ways of contraception had existed for many years. What's different, say if we go to the United States, was FDA approvals given to the birth control pill in 1960. So the 1960s sees for the first time an accessible, reliable way of regulating birth. The commission leaned to reforming church teaching on questions of birth control. At an interim stage, for example, 12 of its 19 members believed that the question was, at least in theory, reformable, or at least not unchangeable. And by the time the final vote by the 15 members in 1966 occurred, 9 of the 15 members of the commission agreed that, quote unquote, not every act of contraception was morally wrong. Interestingly, Karol Wojtyła, who was Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, and of course later St. John Paul II, was supposed to be part of this voting body, but couldn't get from Poland to Rome. He did, however, give comments later on Humanae Vitae, and of course we know that this document anticipates the theology of the body that comes with his pontificate. By the spring of 1967, portions of both the, quote, majority and minority reports had been leaked. These reports illustrate that some of the best and the brightest moral theologians of the Church lacked consensus on the crucial moral questions eventually answered by Humanae Vitae. In light of Vatican II, the promulgation of Humanae Vitae brought forth the valid question of episcopal collegiality, or put another way, primacy versus synodality. Okay, so big words here. Essentially, what is the role of the Pope? Does he operate in concert with other bishops, or does he have primacy over other bishops? If we're kind of thinking about contrasting leadership styles, John Paul II, of course, sort of favored primacy. You see quite a bit more of synodality in the pontificate of Pope Francis. With the exercise of papal authority on a topic that's at the heart of human experience, one might question whether Pope Paul's approach to promulgating the encyclical was consistent with council values. It's why I believe there was backlash against Humanae Vitae from different bishops or conferences of bishops. For example, with the Winnipeg Statement from the Canadian bishops. The background here is that in March of 1968, the Winnipeg Statement reframed the encyclical's claims about marriage and human sexuality rooted in natural law to emphasize instead, the role of private conscience in these matters. I submit, therefore, there was a vision of Paul VI as a pope of the council, and for some, his exercise of papal authority did not reconcile well with an emphasis on the local church and the authority of local bishops, either individually or as conferences such as the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. And interestingly, for a number of years, you could access any number of statements made by the CCCB on their website. The lone exception was the Winnipeg statement. It was quietly eliminated from the website, but never formally retracted, I would point out. For Pope Paul to act alone after championing collegiality and expanding the Pontifical Commission on Population, Family, and Birth, whose mandate was to examine whether traditional views needed to be indeed reviewed or updated, is procedurally suspect. In response to this criticism, Father Kevin McMahon writes, regarding Pope Paul's rejection of the Papal Commission's recommendations for change, three things should be noted. First, that the Commission was established by the Pope as an advisory body and did not indeed, and could not indeed, exercise deliberative power. Second, that every teaching of the Church must be measured against divine revelation, as it is known through sacred scripture and tradition. And third, the Church can teach natural law morality in an authoritative manner. So among these rebuttals, the first one has the most force. Within the Church, critics can accept the second and third ones, yet invariably return to this question of primacy versus collegiality in an attempt to establish points 2 and 3, namely whether or not this is a question of natural law. It would have been, for example, an appropriate topic for an ordinary or an extraordinary General Assembly of Catholic bishops, which had formed in 1967 and continues to today. So the Synod of Catholic Bishops comes out of the post-Vatican II period and meets every sort of 4 years on important matters. So there's one this year on youth, there had just been one on family life, and it's a way for the Church to act in a collegial way. Now this was sort of a new kind of apparatus, but with so many topics being dealt with in this forum, it might have been appropriate to take the recommendations as a basis for having an ordinary or an extraordinary synod. This approach may have warmed the Episcopal response to Humanae Vitae by some members of church leadership. In defense of Pope Paul's approach, Peter Hebblethwaite, author of the definitive biography on the Holy Father, writes, "What was not generally realized was that the Special Pontifical Commission on the questions failed to reach agreement and was therefore dissolved. At this point, the ex-Holy Office, now rebaptized Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, proposed a fierce and uncompromising draft that Paul VI modified in the direction of the majority report. Furthermore, while it is this commission that received the most attention publicly and scholastically, there were two other commissions. The second one was comprised of biblicists, historians, and theologians to study the writings of the Church Father on this matter, a topic Dr. Patey will address. Upon definitively rejecting the use of contraception, this decision was ratified by a third commission comprised of cardinals and other members of the Roman Curia. So perhaps there was at least some element of collegiality, if not full collegiality. What remains clear is that after Humanae Vitae, Paul VI did not write any more encyclicals. So when we think that Paul VI is Pope for another 10 years, and he writes in a variety of other capacities, right? He has apostolic exhortations and other capacities. As far as his encyclicals go, and he had written some beautiful encyclicals in the short number of years leading up to 1968, he doesn't write any more encyclicals. And part of the thinking is that there was such controversy and in some ways such backlash to his approach and perhaps to the content of Humanae Vitae that he chose not to express papal teachings in this way. Thus, based on this evidence, the true enigma is this. was Paul VI open to collegiality on questions of sexual ethics? In a letter to a cardinal on the 10th of October 1965, forbidding the council to address clerical celibacy, while subsequently proceeding to issue Sacerdotalis Celibatus on the 24th of June 1967. This is a document that talks about opening this question of whether or not we need or should have, or questions of clerical celibacy, raises some doubt. In conjunction with the divide between the majority position of the First Papal Commission on Birth Control and the content of Humanae Vitae, it appears he did not favor collegiality on doctrinal matters that he considered absolute and immutable, ones rooted in the natural law or well established in the writings of the Church Fathers. However, in conclusion, this is where I'm going to stop, we might reflect carefully on the words of Pope John Paul II from Familiaris Consortio. Following Christ, the Church seeks truth, which is not always the same as the majority in it.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. I ask, dear audience, that you please hold your questions near to your heart until our afterwards Q&A. Our next speaker is Dr. Ariana Patey. After her MA in Near Eastern and Middle Eastern history at the University of London, our speaker completed her PhD in theology at Haythrop College at the same university. Now working on her license in medieval studies through PIMS, Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, Dr. Patey presently teaches at the Department of Religious Studies as an assistant professor and SDU visiting scholar of Catholic Studies. She has also taught at MUN, U of T, and she has been the chaplain at St. Francis Xavier University, the associate chaplain, sorry. Dr. Patey has spoken, taught, and written on Charles Foucault, Muslim-Christian relations, the martyrs of Cordoba, Spain, and more. Of her 4 publications in progress right now, our young scholar's work of most pertinence to tonight's talk is Pleasure and Pain, the Catholic Body. Her talk this evening is titled Humanae Vitae, in the light of the Church Fathers. Without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Ariana Patey.
First off, I would like to second Dr. Rob's thank yous for all of you this evening, for everybody involved with organizing. Thank you so much. I'm also going to time myself because it's probably the safest way for me. I like to talk, as some of you already know. I also, at this moment, want to acknowledge the fact that what's really interesting about this panel is that we have a historian, a theologian, and a philosopher, and we're all going to come at this from different positions. So while Rob is interested in talking about, papal primacy versus synodality, I'm like, right off the bat, it's going to be one of the first things I say, immaterial to this question. I think we can safely say that the reception of Humanae Vitae was rocky. It had a rough landing. And not just in the secular communities or in the wider Christian communities, but within the Catholic community as well. And not just in the private practice of Catholics themselves, but among Catholic scholars. Catholic scholars have questioned the encyclical and its teachings almost from the get-go. And that, I think, had a very big ripple effect in the wider world. It made many people think that dissent in this issue of contraception was something that was totally fine, excellent, great. The theologians are doing it, everybody have at it. And there are lots of reasons for this scholarly debate, for why Catholic theologians were arguing about this in the years following the promulgation of the encyclical. And Rob has mentioned some of them. But from a theological perspective, which is where I'm coming from, I think the major problem is conflating the teachings on contraception with the document Humanae Vitae itself. What do I mean by that? Like a lot of issues, and Rob really aptly described this, I think, like a lot of theological issues in the Catholic Church in the mid-20th century and still ongoing today, it got mired down in the question of authority. So in this case, the debate among scholars immediately out of the gate was not a discussion about the morality of contraception per se, but rather about this one encyclical, this one document. Is it authoritative? And if the question is that it's not, for example, an infallible document, then I can dissent from it. That means the teachings, I can dissent from the teachings. In fact, that is the exact pattern, for example, that the theologian Karl Rahner, very famous theologian in the 20th century, who I respect in many ways, but that was his thinking at this time. So the debaters, and even in the commission that Rob spoke of in the preparation, they were focusing on the 20th century. And in the debate afterwards, they focused not just on the 20th century, but on this one document. They almost never discussed, for example, any other papal encyclicals of the 20th century that also mentioned contraception. So the debaters, and I think this is important, considered the document to not be infallible, and therefore that their dissent from the teachings it contained was licit dissent. It was acceptable dissent. I don't want to get bogged down right now in the authoritative status of the document. We can talk about that in questions if you like. For me, what's much more interesting and much more important is the fact that this debate obscures the teaching of the document itself and consequently the teaching of the Church. As Humanae Vitae itself notes, in several places, that the teaching on contraception is, and I quote here, the constant teaching of the Church. This is true, therefore the teaching on contraception that this document, this encyclical, reaffirms cannot be disregarded, regardless of the status of the document itself. So that's where I'm coming from. And I think no better way to start this is to go all the way back to the Church Fathers. As Rob alluded to, contraception is not new. The earliest documents we have on contraception are Egyptian. Dating is difficult, but it's probably around the year 2000 BC. And so what this means for us is that contraception has existed for the entirety of Christian history. And it's been in use for the entirety of Christian history. I like to go back to the early church, to early Christianity here for two reasons. First, because it's the situation in which the church formulates these arguments, these discussions about contraception first. And secondly, because the contraceptive situation in early Christianity was particularly interesting because the techniques during the 100 years on either side of the birth of Christ were more widespread and more effective than at any other time in Western history prior to the late 19th century. So, for example, half of the Roman medical texts that we have access to include contraceptive methods. It's coupled with abortion in a lot of texts. The doctors notice that you can't really practically tell much of a difference, but they treat them theoretically as separate concepts. Admittedly, we're dealing with a mix of effective and ineffective methods. Nobody's denying that. But at the same time, there's significant evidence that from the 1st century AD, among the Roman upper class, that these contraceptive techniques had a significant impact on the size of families at the time. And this was an issue for the Romans. It was certainly an issue for the Roman government, which was concerned about family size, if not contraception per se. It was also an issue for Roman philosophers who had issues with contraception. And it was also of concern for that other culture out of which Christianity emerged, which is Judaism. Contemporaneous with the Church Fathers is the development of Talmudic Judaism, of the Talmudic tradition. And here we see rabbis condemn, or at least refuse to recommend, a variety of contraceptive techniques. Despite condemnation, and we have this from Roman philosophers, we have this from Jewish rabbis, contraception was something that was practiced by Jews and Romans alike. We're unsure about the lower classes, but it's not up for debate, I don't think, really anymore among historians, that it was a significant factor amongst the upper class. So, for example, St. Ambrose of Milan would differentiate that the poor of the Roman Empire would abandon their infants if they couldn't care for them or didn't want them, whereas the upper class would resort to potions, either to prevent conception or to force abortion. This situation of contraception and abortion was, as one Roman historian has put it, fashionable. It was fashionable in upper class Roman society to regulate the size of your family using contraceptive methods. I think this has a deep resonance with the modern era. I think we can really feel something here. We can see ourselves in that moment. I don't feel comfortable completely using terms like the contraceptive mentality or the culture of death to refer to the Romans. Other people will. But I think the Romans honestly speak for themselves. We have lots of literature from the 1st century AD speaking of the Roman desire not to have children. And very evocatively, Pliny the Younger, who is a magistrate and letter writer, in a letter to his friend that he wrote around the year 100 AD, he described his father as a good man, a good citizen, who had had several children, quote, in an age when even one child is thought a burden, preventing the rewards of childlessness. So for us, I think it's important to remember, and it's something we often consider contraception, especially in Humanae Vitae, to be a modern issue. But Christianity emerges from a moral theological tradition, the Jewish one, that does not support contraception, into a world where it is relatively widely used and accepted. And it tries to evangelize in this culture, and it tries to survive, literally, in this culture. But what does Christianity do? Christianity, one of my favorite things, comes out of the gate swinging against contraception. So, for example, the Didache, which is a mid-1st century training manual for converts, part of it lists out things that people who want to be Christian shouldn't do. Stuff like, murder, adultery, fornication, abortion. And then there's also a reference to taking potions, which a lot of scholars believe to be a reference to contraception. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. I'm just gonna hit the big ones. To the Council of Nicaea, which is the first ecumenical council of the church in 325. It condemns sterilization. And I think that couples very, very nicely with the writings and teachings of St. John Chrysostom, who writes a couple of decades after the council, actually, I'm underestimating that, more like 50 decades after the council. He condemns sterilization for both, quote, mutilating the members and by impeding the free choice on behalf of good deeds. This is an argument that you can even hear now echoed in NFP discussions, right? I should also point out that Chrysostom levels the charge of contraception against both women and men, which is an interesting point. He points out, for even if the daring deed be hers, yet the cause of it is yours. Just because you're not the person taking the pill, you knew what was going to happen. And I'm being sassy because the church fathers were fairly sassy, actually. It's one of the reasons I like them so much. They're full of personality. St. Jerome and St. Augustine, two great church fathers who disagreed on so many things with regards to sexuality, they both agreed that contraception was not permissible. St. Augustine actually argues that it attacks the nature of marriage. And to quote one of his more rhetorical flourishes, he says about contraception, "Why then that you do not prohibit marriage, when you take from marriage what marriage is? When this is taken away, husbands are shameful lovers, wives are harlots, Bridal chambers are brothels, and father-in-laws are pimps. He's a measured man, that St. Augustine. And that's just one of his. He's got more. That was the one I thought was. If you were falling asleep, the dropping of the word pimp in a church basement might wake you up. The other thing of importance that I think we should note here is that the church fathers, they certainly saw it as an attack on the nature of what sex is supposed to be, which I think Peter is going to talk about more firmly in a moment, or at least I'm assuming, in some way. If he doesn't, you can come after me for that. The church fathers also connected contraceptive practice with faulty theology. For example, they associated it with heresies, such as they associated with Gnosticism, with the Manichaeans, with Roman religions, with false ideas about the nature of human life and human sexuality. Basically, it was not compatible with a belief in Christ for them. And this, I'm just going to sweep ahead to the beginning as we come down to my 12th minute. This teaching continues throughout Christian history. It's the teaching of all the Christian churches until 1930. The foundation that the church fathers laid was so firm that it stands through the Protestant Reformation and various Protestant dissolves as they break away. That's not my area. Don't quote me on that. So it was the teaching of all the Christian churches until 1930. And until at least 1962, and we can debate this, Catholic bishops throughout the world universally agreed in their judgment and teaching on contraception. John Noonan, who's a very famous historian who is very much against contraception, at the same time was able to write in his great epic book, which ended up being an argument against contraception, he was able to write still. No Catholic theologian has ever taught contraception is a good act. He was able to teach that. So what is reaffirmed in Humanae Vitae is the constant and universal teaching of the church. If those theologians who had kind of gotten all caught up in the post-Vatican II, is it a synod, is it the Pope, argument, Pope politics, if you will, and maybe thought about the church fathers a little bit more, they wouldn't necessarily have had the debate that they had had. I'm not saying it wouldn't have existed in the first place. I'm just saying it might not have gotten as big as it did. As such, I'd just like to end with a quotation from Pope Pius XII in his address to the midwives in 1951, and he says, "This teaching is as valid today as it was yesterday, and it will be the same tomorrow and always." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patey. Much like every minute of carpooling with her is filled with Hamilton the musical, every minute of her talk is packed with theological information. Our last speaker this evening is Dr. Peter Karl Koritansky. Educated at CUA, the Catholic University of America, our speaker later completed his PhD at the University of Toronto. After his assistant professorship in philosophy and in religious studies at UPEI, Dr. Koritansky began teaching as an associate professor of the same, where he is now department chair. Dr. Koritansky has also taught at Notre Dame and Ateneo Pontificio Regina Apostolorum, among others. Dr. Koritansky's list of publications and speaking engagements span subjects from philosophy of punishment, natural law, happiness, bioethics, human dignity, usury and economic justice, to theology of the body, as well as covering thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, Jacques Maritain, Alistair MacIntyre, and others. Dr. Koritansky's forthcoming publication, of interest to many contemporary laymen, and their heathen counterparts, is titled Engaging the Skeptic, Essays Addressing the Modern Atheist's Most Serious Objections to the Catholic Philosophical Worldview. In spite of the mouthful of a title, I hear the book is addressed to your ordinary person. Though our last speaker of the evening, I am certain that a great many must look up to Dr. Koritansky, not only vertically, but academically, and in matters of both filial and religious piety. His talk is titled Humanae Vitae, the enduring significance of natural law. Please welcome Dr. Peter Koritansky.
Thank you, Brandon. After that introduction, I feel as though I have to say something clever or witty, but I'm sorry. Nothing's coming to me. Okay, so as Brandon just said, my talk is entitled Humanae Vitae and the Enduring Significance of Natural Law. So this may sound like a strange title to some, since a popular criticism of the document we're discussing tonight is that it allegedly bases its reasoning upon the philosophy of personalism and not upon the philosophy of natural law. This is in spite of the fact that Paul VI explicitly and repeatedly mentions natural law in the document itself. The Church, he says, is in urging men to the observance of the precepts of natural law, which it interprets by its consistent doctrine, teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. But what is natural law? The earliest allusion to it in Christian literature comes in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, in which he attempts to make sense of those Gentiles who act according to the law of Moses, and yet who do not have the law of Moses. As the apostle famously argues, quote, "When the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts." This passage would become one of Thomas Aquinas' favorites in discussing the natural law, which he described as nothing other than divine providence as it applies to human nature. Just as the proper combination of food, sunlight, and pruning will cause an apple tree to flourish and bear fruit, so also acting in certain ways, and also refraining from acting in certain ways, will cause human beings to flourish. What is so striking about natural law, as opposed to divine providence considered more broadly, though, is the dimension of freedom. Freedom. Aquinas' words on this score are truly arresting, even 800 years later. Now, among all others, says Thomas, the rational creature, that is to say the human creature, is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of divine providence, by being provident both for itself and for others. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature, that is to say the human creature, is called the natural law. So we do not merely follow our nature given to us by God by instinct, but by choice. And so we are also capable of choosing to act in ways that run counter to that nature. This is why, of course, the natural law is also a moral law. It's not just the laws of physics or the law of nature in some Newtonian sense. Now, one of the things that's so striking about the reasoning of Humanae Vitae is that it's at once rooted in natural law, but goes considerably beyond natural law doctrine as traditionally understood, even beyond what we see, for example, in Augustine or Aquinas. We would do well to notice that in this document, procreation is only one of the four essential dimensions of what Paul VI calls the conjugal act between spouses. In addition to being essentially procreative, conjugal love, he argues, is also essentially unitive, because it involves the complete gift of oneself to one's spouse. There is a language of the body in sexual relations between spouses that non-verbally but still unmistakably says, I am completely yours, without reservation, without conditions. We are now one flesh. This is why, of course, premarital sex, according to the Catholic tradition, is wrong, even if it's open to life. Because unmarried couples, by definition, have not given themselves fully to one another, the language they speak to one another in the sexual act is essentially mendacious, at the most fundamental level. What follows from this is also something that traditional natural law theory may well have missed, namely that sex, even between spouses, that is solely for the sake of procreation, is equally contrary to the natural law as contraceptive sex between spouses. This is something that comes out of the teaching of Humanae Vitae just as much as the condemnation of contraception. If in the sexual act, for example, a man looks at his wife as nothing other than an incubator for his future child, or his wife looks at him as nothing but a sperm donor, they do violence to the sexual act no less than the contracepting couple. Undoubtedly, one of the most important aspects of the Catholic understanding of natural law is also that of conscience. And this goes right back to St. Paul's reference in the book of Romans to the law written on our hearts that I referenced a minute ago. The reason that Gentiles, without the law of Moses, can discern between good and evil, and why they are without excuse when they do choose evil, is because their human nature, equipped with reason, gives them access to the unchanging moral law created by God. I mention this in particular because it is at once one of the most important aspects of the natural law tradition, as well as one of the greatest sources of error. And unfortunately, we see this very clearly in the controversy over Humanae Vitae and contraception. In the wake of Humanae Vitae, many a confused theologian insisted that, in spite of the document's explicit moral teaching, the ultimate standard that we must consult when it comes to contraception is our own personal consciences. The Church's teaching shouldn't be simply ignored, of course, but what's truly important is whether or not we believe that what we're doing in the confines of our marriages is right in our own heart of hearts. Elevating conscience as this highest tribunal, this confused theology tragically made its way into pastoral letters, one of the most infamous of which hits very close to home in the well-known Winnipeg Statement, referenced by Dr. Dennis and promulgated by the Canadian bishops, who did not explicitly condemn the teaching of Humanae Vitae, but who nonetheless undermined it by stating that users of contraception should be, quote, assured that whoever honestly chooses that course which seems right to him does so in good conscience. End of quote. On examination, this statement can only be one of two things: incorrect or foolishly circular. What is meant by in good conscience? If it means that users of contraception are doing something objectively good, the statement openly contradicts the teaching of Humanae Vitae, something the Canadian bishops themselves insisted they were not doing. But if all it means is that users of contraception believe that what they're doing is good, the bishops were merely saying that those who honestly choose what seems right to them are honestly choosing what seems right to them. The same, of course, could be said of adulterers, thieves, embezzlers, and those who light homeless people on fire in their spare time. This confusion confusion on the part of theologians, philosophers, priests, and bishops spread very quickly to the laity, as it always does. But it was not just a confusion of the vexed and controversial issue of contraception. It engendered, or perhaps revealed, a much deeper confusion regarding the Catholic understanding of morality itself. Something that neither Humanae Vitae nor any papal encyclical had ever addressed. In 1986, therefore, it was high time that the subject of morality be addressed by Pope John Paul II, which is precisely what he did in the release of his encyclical letter, Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth. This document, I would like to suggest, provides the blueprint as to how we might approach Humanae Vitae and the difficult teachings it presents. It is a rich and powerful document. I cannot recommend it highly enough, and I will not even pretend to summarize its teaching. I'll instead focus only on one crucial aspect of that document that deals with the pivotal question of conscience. By the 1980s, Pope John Paul II was well aware of how badly Catholic theologians had gotten this concept wrong. Part of the confusion stemmed from a misinterpretation, not of Humanae Vitae, but of the pivotal Second Vatican Council document, Gaudium et Spes, which famously referred to conscience as, quote, man's sanctuary. Man's sanctuary. The words of the Council Fathers are indeed arresting. In the depths of his conscience, they say, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience, always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. End of quote. But what does it mean to analogize that conscience is our sanctuary? What is a sanctuary? In some uses of that term, it simply is a kind of safe place that no one else may go. This is a sense of sanctuary whereupon those pursued by police may claim sanctuary in a church. We often hear people refer to their homes as their sanctuaries, protected under the laws of private property. But as John Paul II observes, the Catholic understanding of a sanctuary includes much more than this. And we must understand the language of the Council as referring to something like the sanctuary of a church. What's that? The place where God physically resides. The holiest part of the church, because at its center is the tabernacle enclosing Jesus Christ himself in the flesh. This is the analogy that we have to focus in on. And so likewise, to call our conscience a sanctuary, we should not be led to imagine some mysterious part of our soul from which we make the important decisions of our lives and with which no one else may rightfully interfere. We must understand rather that part of our soul in which God himself reveals his law, the natural law. The point here is that the judgment of our consciences has no authority of its own right. And so we are referred by Pope John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor to the teaching of St. Bonaventure, that conscience, not possessing any authority of its own, is like the herald of a king, from whom alone it receives its binding force. The herald speaks not on his own authority, but on the king's authority. Without question, the more recent statements made by the Canadian bishops and other bishops' conferences on the matter of contraception have been much more encouraging. And this is, and it's not just because they eliminated the Winnipeg statement from their website. This is undoubtedly due to the pontificate of Pope John Paul II. just 10 years ago, on the encyclical's 40th anniversary. For instance, the bishops published their pastoral letter, Liberating Potential, in which they wisely remarked that, quote, Humanae Vitae is much more, it is much more than just a no to contraception. This encyclical is, in reality, a major reflection of God's design for human love. It proposes a vision of the whole man and the whole mission to which he is called, both its natural, earthly aspects and its supernatural, eternal aspects. It is an invitation to be open to the grandeur, beauty, and dignity of the Creator's call to the vocation of marriage. This is the bishops speaking in 2008. This is, of course, not a formal retraction of the Winnipeg Statement, but it could easily be read as such. Most importantly, it reminds us that Humanae Vitae, for all its controversy, contains a teaching that should be cherished by Catholics, and not merely for the moral evils it helps us avoid, but for the rich conception of marital love, which it invites us to share. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koritansky. We will now begin our Q&A. I ask our speakers, oh yes, they are coming up to the examination table, the cross-examination table. I will cue the questions of you, our dear listeners. I therefore ask your patience. You may raise your hands. Yes.
Just a question with regard to contraception. This is based off of my limited reading, and this is for anyone who wants to read Malcolm Gladwell's With the Dogs. He has a great article about this. But it was about the pill. And it was solely that. That was in 1960. A Catholic scientist says the pill is to help NFP. And the question goes, is humanity taking the pill, or is the Pope looking at condoms and everything else, all the other 50s forms and everything else? Because maybe the second part, why then it came out, obviously we know why. Why did it come out in the 50s? At the beginning of the sexual revolution, the kids were having more and more sex. So that's the question. Is it solely, was the pill that, that contraceptive issue? If you don't think it's okay.
Yeah, I would say that, with the widespread availability of the pill in the 1960s, it's a game changer. I really do. And I think that there are a lot of people who were trying to make sense of it, whether they were not critically thinking about it or thinking about it in light of faith, or whether there was just a narrative particularly within the West, that this is a great thing, this is an excellent thing, and that there was a proliferation of its use. So I would suggest that while the document doesn't explicitly zero in on just the pill, I mean it's a wider conversation. That is certainly the impetus, I think, for why in '68 it came to.
I'll maybe just add one thing to that. I think, in some senses, I think the bishops and perhaps the Holy Father himself also understood that for many people, there was a question as to whether the pill even constituted contraception. I've heard people even say, we're using the birth control pill, so we don't need to use contraception. I know, or that sort of a thing. So that was another thing that sort of was the encyclical was able to clarify. But yes, it would be very, very oversimplifying to say that it was about contraception. That may be, as Rob says, what precipitated the urgency with which this had to be written and promulgated, but it's about so much more, as of course if you pick up the document and read it, as I'm sure you have, you'll see right away.
I'll add a little something as well. There were discussions about, in fact, the pill assisting regulating the cycles of women to facilitate NFP. In fact, actually, you find that in the private letters of Cardinal Humanae and Jacques Maritain, that they're discussing they're like, is this could be a good thing if this, so I mean the concerns about the science were there. The other thing that had happened is in 1963, I believe it was 1963, there were 3 or 4 German theologians who had, for the first time, published articles questioning the church's teaching on contraception. And then we had the commission that came out, and then the very famous footnote 14 in Gaudium et Spes, which said, we can't make a full discussion on this, we've got a commission to check it out. So that, from my perspective, and it was connected to what I was speaking of, there was reaching a fever pitch, this idea that it could change, that this teaching could change. It was becoming, and so there was, this made the encyclical have to happen to a certain extent. There was such widespread confusion as the Vatican Council continued and then ended. And then
Yes, in the back.
Question in some ways doesn't pertain to what you're talking about.
Maybe somebody else will take it then.
My question is this. My wife and I taught natural medical for 25 years. And we practiced it in our own marriage for most of the time. The reality is, when you work with young people, you're approaching marriage, and you get into this subject, they are totally convinced that the church is crazy. Many of them come to us and say, especially men, say, the only reason we're here is so the Father will get off our back. He told us we had to come, so we're here. You know? So we say, okay, we'll teach this stuff until Father will get. But what's that accomplish? We need somehow a discussion of how we get past that kind of perception. And one of the ways we tried to use, that I think on occasion was successful, was to point out to the couple that if you decide to take a pill, then it's the wife's responsibility. If you decide to use a condom, then it's the man's responsibility. Where does all of this build a couple? People together working at their common objectives. And that doesn't seem to come out of any of the encyclicals. But somehow, to me, strategically, the church has to stop talking about what we're against and start talking about what can be achieved in human relationships if, in fact, we start to think of it that way.
That's a good point.
you've almost hit on my alternative talk, which was going to be Humanae Vitae and #MeToo. Because I think that's an entryway for a lot of young people, which is when I teach moral theology, is the idea that sex isn't a right. And most people go, of course not, of course it's not. Well, okay, well what about modern culture leads people to think that sex is a right? And I think you can also make a very good argument, as you say, for the pill as a I'll controversially say it, as a feminist issue. I can certainly make that argument. So I appreciate that. And despite the fact that my talk was things you can't do, just mostly because I wanted to quote Augustine, and he very much likes telling you the things you can't do. I think there's, as Peter brilliantly put forward, I thought.
Well, it is put forward.
I'm still new in the department. As Peter elucidated, there is more to the document, the encyclical, than just what you can't do.
One thing I would say is that we live in a world of of hyper-individualism, right? My body, me, that idea even of sexual relations as, like as an individual coming to it, not one entity, one couple. And I think that in some ways that this is where the beauty of Humanae Vitae, beauty of the theology of the body is, and it's so countercultural, is that it's precisely not hyper-individual the way that most of the discourse in our society would be, not just around issues of sexuality, but other things as well. And so the question is, how do we take that beauty? How do we translate it for an audience? Because there is something, for the people who I see get it, it's so attractive. And so I have to think that it would be attractive to many other people too. There's just a barrier there.
Just add one quick point. I don't know exactly how directly this responds to you, Ken, but there is, we shouldn't forget, there is a growing number of people in the modern world using natural family planning and rejecting contraception who are not doing it for Catholic reasons at all. They're not even Catholic. Usually it begins with sort of health concerns. They don't want the hormonal changes that the pill and other life devices cause. But once they do that, they realize that their marriages are better, they're communicating better, they're respecting one another's bodies more, and they may not even be religious at all. They might be atheists, and it's a surprising growing number of people that those who teach natural family planning, perhaps in bigger population centers, are noticing. And so it's not just, in a way, this is the best evidence that this is something pertaining not just to some obscure theological teaching, but to the natural law, the law written on our hearts that we don't necessarily need the church's teaching to understand, but of course it also not.
I think I would agree with you completely. It's almost like bottled water, right? Like in a sense, like, why do we drink bottled water? Well, it's pure, it's cleaner. Yeah, but what you forget is, all the collateral damage that comes along with it, right? Plastic ends up in landfill, etc. So it's almost like, I think, a mindset change, that is happening, at least, as you hear it from, young people compared to 20 years ago.
Question up front.
Do you see any societal benefits that have come from the widespread rejection of Humanae Vitae and the widespread use of contraception?
Societal benefits that have come from the use of contraception.
From the widespread use of it and the widespread rejection of Humanae Vitae.
Less Protestant.
I would say, there's it's interesting. I don't know if this is going to directly answer your question, but
do we see any widespread benefits? Sorry, do we see any benefits of the widespread use of contraception in spite of the teaching of Humanae?
Immediately what springs to mind for me is that Father Barron, or Bishop Barron, has a great video on Humanae Vitae. And he says, it's a prophetic document because it anticipates so many things that have come to fruition. That, the widespread availability of contraception is going to perhaps lead to, state-sponsored family planning. We see that, we saw that for a number of years in China between 79 and 2015, the one-child policy. We see an increasingly permissive society. We see a lot of the negative effects. So, in some ways, what I would say about the document itself, borrowing from Father Barron's point, is that it really does accurately anticipate many things that happen. And I mean, people, I'm sure, could say, well, contraception has enabled us to, help control, the population. Well, there's many ways of, doing that.
I have just one thought, and I'm sure there are probably more things that could be said, but one of the things that good consequences can come from evil things, right? There's nothing problematic with that. In a way, one of the consequences of the widespread use of contraception, even among Catholics, of course, as we know, Catholics use contraception at the same rate that the rest of the population does, is that, I'll have to say, in a way, contraception is an issue that really enables one to recognize the serious Catholics where they are. If someone accepts the teaching on contraception, they mean business, right? Because it's such a hard teaching to accept. And it's an issue which, otherwise good Catholics, have basically just, you gotta think about it. I mean, if you do not accept this very difficult teaching, I'll admit, you have to come to terms with the fact that something your church teaches is incorrect, is just flat out wrong. And so you have to come face to face with the possibility that maybe the teaching on the resurrection is wrong too, as is the teaching on the incarnation. So, in a way, it really does kind of prune the church a little bit. Maybe that's a good thing in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it's surrounded by other bad things, and maybe it is dwarfed into utter insignificance by those bad things, and perhaps it is. But it's one thing I can think of to answer the question. Good question.
In the back.
I was just going to say that, given the pressure in modern society to conform society with individualism, as you mentioned, do you think that the church has done enough? Because, of course, this is the 50th anniversary, we're now receiving some perspectives on the significance of that particular document. But again, it seems to me that what I'm hearing here is a common theme that really we don't know what's underlying this whole thing. That in fact there is a wisdom that was there, that the Pope understood, and others understood, but perhaps that has not been revealed again so that the common layperson can understand. And so, in a day and age of postmodernism and this pressure of individualism and everything else, do you think that, in fact, from your perspective, that in fact enough has been done to, carry that message, to promote that wisdom that was there, that is there?
I would say there's always more that you could do. And sexuality is always one of the reasons I find it interesting in a theological context is it is always one of the battlegrounds for defining who people are. What I mean by that is it is the engaging in, to a certain extent, public action. There's more than one, despite individualism, at least when we're talking about contraception, there's more than one person involved. And so it is not just, what do I believe in my heart of hearts about the resurrection? What do I believe in my heart of hearts about the incarnation? All important things, but we are talking about the public actions of people that consequently then go on to create our culture and how that influences it. So with reserving judgment on what has been done, there's more to do, I think. And it will always be the battleground. It always has been.
I mean, I think in some ways it's a question about secularism in a sense. And what secularism to me means is not that people stop being religious or stop having faith or stop having a relationship with God, but we see widespread, in part, a privatization of religion, a privatization. So someone might have faith, they might believe, even as a Catholic, practicing Catholic, might be very attached to, the liturgy, they might have a relationship with Christ. But then when it comes to questions of, say, human sexuality, there's a natural barrier there. No, that's a private question. Coming back to this idea of conscience, right? That's about conscience. That's not something that the Pope should be, speaking on, or the Church should be, dictating, how I regulate my my family life, with my partner. And I think that's in some ways what we're talking about when we're talking about secularism is that privatization that does not want to embrace church teachings, despite their very long and rooted history on questions of human sexuality. And how you break through that barrier is a very difficult question, I think. Very difficult task.
Hold on, let's make sure someone else.
Years? Oh, sorry.
Let's just make sure someone else, since you've already used it.
Mr. Brown.
Do you think that by not following the Church's teachings on contraception, do you think that would have a greater impact on men or on women? And what might be some differences there? You know what I mean?
Well, I think that the impact is equal on both. As Ariana, human sexuality is something that is central to both man and woman as in equal measure. Yes, of course, it affects men and women differently. I know just from talking to people who teach natural family planning and marriage preparation and so on, that it is a common saying that if after years and years of using contraception, a couple abandons it and starts either just not using it at all or transitioning into natural family planning, women have, I'm told, commonly reported that for the years of their marriage in which they did use contraception, she felt like an object, kind of an object for her husband's gratification, even though she knew that her husband loved her, and even though he was committed to her, and so on. That the moment they began to respect their fertility and not to abuse the sexual act in the way that contraception necessarily does, women felt more like they had a husband who really, really cherished them. That wouldn't be the same experience of a man. That would be very different. But that's so. Yes, it affects man and woman very equally, but certainly in different ways, I would say.
I was just going to say, I think rather than man or woman, it's really about the family. Because a commitment, for example, to natural family planning, as opposed to artificial contraception, really forces one to see every sexual act in the light of family. You see your children as a natural outcome of your sexuality. And if you take that piece out of it, right, even if you say it's just, it's just about unity, just about unitive purposes, beyond, pleasure or other such, hedonistic ideas, right? You lose an essential element. And so, in that sense, I think what contraception does is it divorces that idea of sexuality from family.
And consequently from communication, which is the real, I think, one of the real dangers there. I would just echo there are differences from if we're talking about the pill, for example, from a biological perspective, there are implications for women of sustained use of the contraceptive pill that are not the same for men. There's also, with regards, again, to the pill, the expectation and responsibility is on the woman. I know from the secular world and secular friends and various things like that, a woman gets pregnant, weren't you on the pill? And that was your responsibility. I thought you were on the pill. You didn't take it every day, don't you? So I'm with John Chrysostom and the idea that there is spiritual damage to both, but that it's not necessarily the same. And I don't think it's always the same depending on what method of contraception is used as well. As I said, something like the pill or something like an IUD has a very real biological implication for women. That's my contribution to that question.
I could just add something, just very quickly. I don't know if anyone here has heard or seen the very famous lecture given by Dr. Janet Smith on contraception. But in that lecture, she mentioned something that is very revealing when it comes to the development of the contraceptive pill, which is to say that when they were first trying to develop the contraceptive pill, they were originally trying to develop a male pill that men would take, render them infertile or sterile. And the result of that, there were some side effects. They noticed some shrinkage in the male testicles, and they stopped all development of the male contraceptive pill as a result of that. In developing the female contraceptive pill, I think several women died, and all they did was adjust the dosage. So anyway, I think that's very revealing as to what the contraceptive pill is and what its real motivations have been historically.
We had another question in the middle here.
Lots of questions.
Yes.
All the time. First of all, I want to commend you for your laying out why the document is prophetic and powerful and multidimensional. But I think the thing that concerns me is trying to dig inside the disconnect, the profound disconnect then between this prophetic, powerful, multidimensional truth and this lack of traction. And I'm sure you're not just saying, well, it's laid out there for you, take it or leave it. I'm wondering whether you're suggesting that this pruning is to prune back to true believers in natural law. And I'm not adequate to answer this question, but I'll just pose it. It seems to me that Vatican II is realizing the problematic character of natural law in the 20th century in relation to natural science and all these other sorts of things, and therefore you have to re-articulate these truths. And so I'm impressed in reading Humanae Vitae for the first time. The references to Vatican II. Yes, there are references to natural law, there are references to Thomas, but there are more references at crucial moments to Vatican II. So it seems to me it's part of this struggle for the heart and soul of Vatican II that Pope Benedict has talked about. That larger question of repositioning the unchanging fundamental revelational truths, but giving them purchase, giving them a hold on people. So I'm left happy with your saying how wonderful it is, but I'm still left with the question, well, why don't we get it?
Well, I would say, if we go back to 1960, 68, Vatican II has just so very recently concluded. Really, I think it takes, we're half a century, it's half a century now, still trying to wrestle with the meaning and the legacy of what Vatican II is. What or who are we as a church? After the Second Vatican Council, what does it truly mean to engage the modern world? And I think that I can't imagine in the writing of Humanae Vitae there was really a firm sense of what the church was in the post-Vatican II period. There's of course like an unchanging part of the church, but more this aspect of like this wrestling with modernity, with the modern world. And I think that in some ways Humanae Vitae is an extension of that wrestling, that grappling.
It's true that the Second Vatican Council recognized the problematic nature of talking about natural law in an age of modern physics and modern science. Really, in a way, that had been a problem ever since the scientific revolution and modern gravitational theory and Isaac Newton's Principia. Natural law, I believe, is something that has to be. There's no list of natural laws that you can just go consult and look up. Natural law is something that we rediscover again and again in our historical experience. That's not to say that history is defining when it comes to natural law, but that we see it embedded in different historical and cultural phenomena. Our own age presents probably as great a challenge as there's ever been since maybe the Roman Empire. It is a hostile and fierce world when it comes to these sorts of things. It's in a way, Humanae Vitae is just the beginning. It was Pope John Paul II spent 5, I think, years developing his theology of the body from 1979 to 1984, realizing that Humanae Vitae couldn't be the last word. So much more had to be said. And that is just now, we're just starting to see the effects of that in the world and in the church. And so I think there's a lot of hope there to be had in the theology of the body revolution. I didn't talk much about the theology of the body tonight, but I'll just mention that. That's about as much. Yeah, we got our work cut out for us. That's all I can really say.
I just, as an extension to what you're saying, my husband's actually a creator Catholic, and I'm not even Catholic, but I'm here with a good friend, Jess, and I guess my husband and I have been married for 15 years, and we were married in the Catholic Church. We have marriage prep, and our son is an altar server, and they go to catechism, and we have just learned this doctrine in the last year. So I'm wondering, why isn't it being preached by our priests? Why isn't it part of the catechism? We just wish we'd heard of it sooner. We have 4 beautiful children, and we're just at a loss, really, to be honest. So as a personal story of it, I really feel like, why didn't we know?
Can I ask your name?
Melissa.
Melissa? That breaks my heart
Yeah.
to hear that. And I don't have a good answer for your question.
It just shows there's more work to be done within the church itself.
Yeah, I don't want to. I know part of your question was put in the framework of why hasn't this been preached, and that is certainly, there is certainly blame to be laid there, but I am very loath to place it all at the doorstep of our priests. priests.
No, and
I know that's not what you're trying to do. I know that.
It's unfortunate that we are just learning a bit of this document now. I mean, he grew up in the Catholic Church. I've gone to church with him for 20 years, and I've never heard of this document before. And it is so beautiful. Actually, I was saying to Jess, she sent it to me, I don't know how many months ago, and that one quote that you said near the end about the retraction, that wasn't quite a retraction. I said if I could put into words what I felt when I read that first time, that would be it.
In a way, your question makes me think of Ken's earlier one. What can we do as lay people? And in a way, I think, first of all, as people are preparing for marriage, even if you're not hearing this at Mass from the pulpit, at the very least, there's a responsibility of us, the church, and I include laity and priests as well, and bishops, to make sure that couples preparing for marriage in the Catholic Church hear this, and not just hear the teaching, but actually meet people who are living this way, and realize that, well, Ken said, they think that the church has gone mad. Realize that we're not mad. We're actually pretty normal, people with a lot of the same problems and concerns and struggles that everybody else
I
has.
think coming from someone who grew up Protestant and actually probably more secular than Protestant, not myself, but my own family, I've always felt God's call in my life personally, whether my family went or not. But really, we kind of look at the Catholic Church and we're like, wow, they have such strict rules, and you don't really understand the underpinning of those rules. And so when I read that encyclical, I was like, wow, there's so much beauty there, and it's kind of wanted me to look further into the Catholic Church. It's so beautiful, and I'm just thinking, would have been nice for our marriage path to have been exposed to that at least,
I'm going to make a bit of a generalization, please forgive it.
Yeah, go right ahead.
There has been, I think, as you say, that perception, the Catholic Church has a lot of rules. And rather than explaining the rules and, the joy that can come from the rules, there's just been rules are rules. And I'm making a vast generalization there. I'm not saying that that's what's happening across the board in every parish and every diocese. What I would say, as the onslaught of secularism has kind of come at us, and this real aversion to rules is hitting people where they live, I think sort of everywhere. I mean, you see it in schools, you see it in a variety of places where rules are presented sort of not as rules, as fun suggestions. You see it in parenting techniques and all sorts of different things. So it's not just it's not the choice of the church. The other thing to remember is the people of the church live in the world like everybody else. They're influenced by that culture just like everybody else. So I think that is part of what we're getting at. How can we do better? I mean, it's a question for us, but it's a question for you. It's a question for you, and I think I'm summing it up now. It's a question for you guys as well. If this is something that you feel passionate about, that you love, that you see the joy in, tell somebody. It sounds better, honestly, than coming from us. Coming from me in a classroom, coming from us at a conference, coming from a priest in a pulpit. Honestly, Vatican II's desire to engage the laity, to engage the baptismal promises of the laity is that. It's for the laity to go forth into the lay world and discuss these things.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, the three questions here have been about pastoral initiatives and pastoral ways of, in a way, we're perhaps the least qualified people to be talking about the theologian, and historian, and philosopher. I really don't know, what's going on in the broader culture. I don't know if I even want to know what's going on in the broader culture. I sit in my office and read a lot of books.
We're little academics, basically, is what he's saying.
So really, your answers to these questions are...
I would just say something to echo what Peter said. I think that witness is so important. when people see, and I'm thinking about young people and young families, living out the document, I mean, that witness is more powerful than anything that can get said from a pulpit, anything that can be said in a church basement, and it's infectious. So I think that's really it.
Perhaps the last question, yes.
Last question. One of the things that happened over the years that we observed, and I think it's still happening, was after the Second Vatican Council, we had all kinds of new commissions in the diocese. We had the Social Action Commission, our Family Life Commission, we had Parish Life Commission, we had a Diocese Pastoral Council, we had all this stuff. When we were trying to do our work, the hardest people to convince were the people that were on commissions who dealt with family life. Because their view was that the church had to get with them in terms of what marriage is really like, and talk about communication, and talk about all that kind of stuff, and not get mixed up with this foolishness. And they were allowed to get away with it. And I'm not kidding you. We saw it time and time again. We had marriage again, we had all kinds of marriage preparation programs, and we would always volunteer, and sometimes we would get money. Sometimes the parish would insist. But other than that, lots of times the information is supposed to be given to people in a context where it should be.
Well, it reminds me of the old saying, what's the difference between a member of one of these commissions and a terrorist? You can sometimes negotiate with a terrorist. No, I didn't see a real question in there, but thank you for your comments.
Some of the leadership has enforced that.
Yeah. Oh, we can probably do
One more, perhaps. Don? Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, thank you. One last thing, one thing. It's not really a question, it's a comment. I was born in 1962, so I don't remember Vatican II. I'm a father of 4. I've experienced, my last child has just graduated from high school. We've been through the high school, grade school with their sex ed. We've experienced some governments, our current government whose leader is Catholic. Whatever. That's it goes without saying. So there, I feel like the pebble next to a boulder, and the boulder's crushing me, right? But there's signs of hope. Young guys here. I see my children, being educated in theology and body, attending your Catholic Studies program. I have another child who's a missionary in Ireland, Canada, doing work for the church. I see my youngest thinking about the priesthood, and he's living a chaste life. That boulder, I'm starting to push back. But, the boulder's still there, and it's frightening. But little by little, starting to push it back. Not with force, but with love, Yeah, I wanted to share that. Got some young people here with young, big families. Some, but that sense of hope. Yeah. Sometimes the boulders there, and you don't hear, because there's so much there that you don't hear about those encyclicals and those documents. Media's there, government's there, telling schools there, telling you that there's so much more messages out there that competes against the truth. Yeah. But there's hope.
There is. I mean, if I'm not even Catholic and I bring the document to my husband, then there's hope, right? It's making people more into the faith.
So, thank you all, dear audience, for attending and participating in our discussion. I'm reminded of a quote, not quite as funny as Peter's, about encyclicals. Everybody loves to quote them, nobody likes to read them. So perhaps all of you bulletin readers can share the news with all of your friends about the encyclical, and it sounds like another panel may be in order on where we go from here, pastoral concerns, the sociological effects of the use of contraceptives. If you tune in to your bulletin, you may see another talk coming in the near future. Once again, tonight, the AC and the venue was provided generously by St. Dunstan's Basilica. So we would very much like to thank them. In addition to the Knights of Columbus and Grand Poobah, that is Grand Knight Donald Chevery, a big thanks to Daniel Brown for video recording our lovely session. And a big thanks to Mr. Rene Fair, who organized the whole show. I would like to remind the audience at this point that there were refreshments and food in the back, and I've also been asked to inform you that the Augustine Institute has CDs and books which will be available for sale here also. Thank you again to Doctors Rob Dennis, Ariana Patey, and Peter Koritansky. Lastly, thank you once more, dear audience, for your attention. It has been a pleasure to have been your host and moderator. Good night, and see you next time.